On April 16th, in broad daylight, the Great Falls National Bank was brazenly robbed. An elderly cashier was killed, and the robber escaped with a substantial sum of money. The investigation that followed crossed state lines and even international borders, ultimately leading to the arrest of a young Summerssworth resident named Joseph Kelly, a man known for his peculiar habits. But the most astonishing developments came in the courtroom, when Joseph Kelly was asked to explain his actions. He declared that he was ready to plead guilty on one condition: his execution had to take place on January 16th, 1898. His reason was stranger still. Kelly claimed he had made a contract with the devil himself, and that the contract would expire on January 15th. The court now faced an unsettling dilemma. Was the young man suffering from a mental disorder? Was he pretending to be insane to avoid the gallows? Or was there something even more disturbing hidden behind his claims of a pact with dark forces? In the late 19th century, Summerssworth was a typical New England industrial town. Textile factories and mills formed the backbone of its economy, powered by the waterfalls of the Salmon Falls River. The town was growing and prospering, drawing workers with the promise of steady employment and opportunity. The Great Falls National Bank stood at the very heart of the community, a symbol of its financial stability. Mill owners, merchants, and manufacturers passed through its doors daily. For many, the bank represented proof that small-town Summerssworth was confidently stepping into a new century. Yet most laborers lived modestly, renting inexpensive rooms in boarding houses scattered throughout the town. Tenants rarely stayed long. Some left in search of better prospects, others started families elsewhere, and some simply vanished, occasionally without settling their debts. As for psychiatry, society was only beginning to understand disorders of the mind. Institutions for the mentally ill already existed, and medicine was taking its first serious steps toward classification and treatment. But the line between criminal behavior and mental illness remained blurred. Physicians employed emerging medical terminology to describe patients' conditions, yet diagnosis was often more art than science. Joseph Kelly was born in the town of Amesbury into a large family of 10 children. Neighbors and acquaintances once described the Kelly children as bright and capable. Though the family was not wealthy, they were close-knit. In his early years, young Joe was no different from his siblings, a quiet, obedient, unremarkable boy. But at the age of 4, tragedy struck. Joseph fell, and a rusty nail pierced his skull. For 3 days he lay unconscious, hovering between life and death. Doctors doubted he would survive, but the boy pulled through. The consequences of that injury, however, soon became apparent. After the accident, Joseph began suffering from seizures and convulsions. At night, he sleepwalked, alarming his family with his strange wanderings through the house. The once quiet and compliant child gradually changed. He grew unpredictable, impulsive. By the age of 10, according to his family, Joe was no longer the same person. In Amesbury, he acquired a nickname that relatives would later avoid repeating to reporters. Those who once praised his intelligence now shook their heads at his troubling behavior. Joseph began committing petty theft. At first, it was minor: apples stolen from a neighbor's orchard, small items taken from local shops. But the offenses escalated. He stole bicycles and committed break-ins. Eventually, after another unlawful entry into a private home, young Kelly was sent to a reform school in Concord, where he spent about 7 months. Upon his release, Joseph resolved to start over and moved to Summerssworth, New Hampshire. There, He rented a modest room in a boarding house and tried to find his place in the world. He was only 24 years old, and it seemed as though many possibilities still lay ahead of him. But fate had other plans. The room Joseph Kelly rented at his boarding house had a remarkable feature. It sat directly across from the Great Falls National Bank. From his window, he had a clear view of the bank building. Every day, he could observe what was happening just across the street. His attention was especially drawn to the elderly cashier, Joseph Stickney, who sat by the window counting money. Green banknotes, gold and silver coins. Stacks of bills grew higher on the desk, coins gleamed in the light, and all that wealth lay just steps away. Kelly was desperate for money. He had fallen into debt, and his financial situation was deteriorating. At the same time, he was imaginative and constantly trying to invent unusual ways to earn a living. He sold artificial bouquets on the streets, hoping passers-by would appreciate his merchandise. When that failed to bring in enough income, he tried something even more original, climbing onto the roof of a hotel with a megaphone and shouting advertisements for local merchants. It was certainly a spectacle, and Kelly drew attention, but it brought in very little cash. He had another passion as well, writing poetry. Poetry was his outlet, a way to express his inner world, his longings and dreams. He genuinely believed himself to be a true poet. His verses reflected romantic ideals, hopes for a better life, and meditations on fate. He treasured every line he composed. But romantic dreams clashed harshly with reality. His debts mounted. The landlady demanded payment. There was no money. And across the street, day after day, the old cashier counted thousands of dollars. The image haunted Kelly. Gradually, an idea began to take shape in his mind. What if he simply walked into the bank and took the money? At first, it was just a fleeting thought, but with each passing day, it grew stronger, more persistent, more real. The vision of easy wealth would not leave him alone. Eventually, Joseph Kelly began to form a plan. Kelly's plan was surprisingly simple. No elaborate schemes, no accomplices. Just himself, a disguise, and determination. He knew that the elderly cashier recognized him. They had exchanged greetings on the street, and Kelly had occasionally visited the bank for minor errands. The first step, therefore, was to ensure the old man would not recognize him. Kelly obtained a set of fake mustache and beard, simple theatrical props meant to alter his appearance completely. He also secured a revolver to give himself confidence and intimidate anyone who might interfere. Finally, he chose an ordinary pillowcase to carry the money. That was the entirety of his equipment for what he imagined would be the robbery of a lifetime. As the day approached, the plan consumed him. It was no longer just an idea, it became an obsession. Kelly mentally rehearsed every step, how he would enter, what he would say, how quickly it would unfold, how he would leave with the money. The image of himself walking out of the bank with a pillowcase stuffed with cash filled his thoughts day and night. On April 15, 1897, Joseph Kelly decided the moment had come. He put on the fake mustache and beard, took his revolver, and crossed the street toward the bank. His heart pounded. His hands trembled slightly, but he stepped inside. Unexpectedly, a female customer was there, calmly speaking with the cashier. Kelly had not anticipated this. The presence of another person threw him off balance. Fear gripped him. What if she screamed? What if everything went wrong? He turned around and walked out without taking any action. But retreat only strengthened his resolve. Kelly returned to his room and spent a restless night reviewing every detail. Tomorrow, he decided, he would not back down. Tomorrow, it would happen. On April 16th, Joseph Kelly once again put on the fake mustache and beard, concealed his revolver, and carried the pillowcase with him. This time, he was determined to finish what he had started. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street and entered the Great Falls National Bank. There were no other customers inside, only the elderly cashier, Joseph Stickney, at his usual post. Kelly approached the counter and calmly asked to purchase a few postage stamps. Unaware of any danger, Stickney nodded and went into the cash room to retrieve them. Kelly followed him and quietly closed the glass door behind them. The old cashier turned, and in that moment, he sensed something was wrong. Perhaps he recognized the young regular customer despite the false beard. Perhaps he saw something in Kelly's eyes that revealed the danger. Stickney cried out, calling for the police. What happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes. In the confined space of the cash room, behind the closed glass door, tragedy struck. Joseph Stickney, who had worked peacefully at the bank for many years, counting money by the window day after day, did not survive the encounter. His life ended in the very place where he had spent so many quiet working hours. With shaking hands, Kelly hurriedly stuffed money into the pillowcase. $4,125 in bills and coins, an enormous sum at the time. His movements were frantic and rushed, but when he tried to leave the cash room, he realized the glass door had locked when he closed it. Panicked, Kelly smashed the glass, climbed out, and looked around. The bank was still empty. No customers, no witnesses. Carrying the pillowcase full of money, Joseph Kelly walked out of the bank and crossed the street back to his boarding house. Astonishingly, he behaved as if nothing had happened. He went upstairs to his room, hid the pillowcase, removed his disguise, and calmly came down for dinner. He ate alongside the other boarders, engaging in ordinary conversation. After the meal, he approached the landlady and handed her $20, the rent he had long been unable to pay. Then Kelly returned to his room, transferred the money from the pillowcase into a travel suitcase, and headed for the train station. Meanwhile, Joseph Stickney's body still lay in the cash room behind the shattered glass door. More than 2 hours would pass before anyone discovered the horrific scene. Joseph Stickney's body lay in the cash room for more than 2 hours before it was discovered. Once news of the tragedy spread through Summerssworth, police immediately launched an investigation. Joseph Kelly quickly became a suspect. His sudden disappearance from the boarding house and his unexpected repayment of debts raised serious questions. Investigators initially believed Kelly could not have acted alone and assumed he had accomplices. They also suspected he had fled south to his home state of Massachusetts, possibly returning to his family in Amesbury. In Waltham, 2 men were arrested on suspicion of involvement in the Summerssworth robbery. However, both soon established solid alibis and were released. Meanwhile, the real Joseph Kelly was heading in the opposite direction. From Summerssworth, he boarded a train on the Boston and Maine Railroad and traveled to Union, Maine. There, he transferred to another train bound for Cookshire Junction in the Canadian province of Quebec. From there, Kelly boarded the Halifax Express and purchased a ticket to Montreal. His escape plan was clear: cross the U.S. border and disappear into Canada, where American authorities would have greater difficulty reaching him. When Summerssworth police realized Kelly had gone north rather than south, they began retracing his route. The trail led them to the small Quebec town of Saint-Justin-de-Newton. There, something peculiar occurred. Kelly entered a local inn and made an unusual request. He offered $10 in gold for a woman's dress. The innkeeper, evidently unconcerned with the reason, agreed to the sale. Kelly changed into the dress and left, explaining that he intended to surprise his wife in Montreal. It was in this disguise, still wearing the woman's dress, that Joseph Kelly was ultimately found by police in Montreal. He was discovered in an entertainment establishment, seated between two women of questionable reputation, appearing entirely at ease. If the disguise had been meant to deceive authorities, it failed spectacularly. Kelly was arrested and extradited back to New Hampshire to stand trial for murder and robbery. His strange behavior during his flight, the purchase of a dress, the visit to a questionable venue, the apparent lack of caution, already led many to question whether the young man was of sound mind. When news of Joseph Kelly's arrest reached Amesbury, the town was stunned. Reporters quickly descended upon his family, seeking insight into the young man accused of such a horrific crime. The 10 Kelly children had long been regarded as bright and capable, and their parents had spoken proudly of their accomplishments. Now, however, the tone shifted. Those who once praised Joseph began recalling different details. It emerged that he had carried a nickname few cared to repeat in polite society: Foolish Joe. Neighbors remembered his odd behavior following the head injury at age 4, his seizures, his sleepwalking, his unpredictable conduct. Even so, many were shocked by the murder charge. Petty theft? Breaking and entering? That sounded like Joe. But murder? Numerous residents of Amesbury believed that if he had been involved in the bank robbery at all, it must have been as an accomplice, not the mastermind. It was difficult to reconcile the quiet, eccentric young man who wrote poetry and sold artificial flowers on the street with the bold killer described in headlines. Yet the evidence pointed directly to him. Kelly was extradited from Canada to New Hampshire. He would stand trial in Dover, a proceeding that promised to become one of the most unusual in the state's history. The trial of Joseph Kelly began on November 8, 1897, in Dover, New Hampshire. On the first day, jurors were placed on a train and taken to Summerssworth so they could view the scene of the crime, the bank itself, and Kelly's room in the boarding house across the street, the very window from which he had watched the cashier. What struck nearly everyone was the defendant's behavior. Joseph Kelly smiled constantly, both in Summerssworth and in the courtroom. He seemed to relish the attention. Reporters, courtroom artists, spectators. For a man who had spent his life trying to be noticed, the sudden notoriety was almost intoxicating. The prosecution presented witnesses, individuals who had seen Kelly on the day of the crime, railroad employees who tracked his movements, and the Quebec innkeeper who had sold him the woman's dress. During cross-examination, the defense focused on Kelly's peculiarities, his poetry, his unconventional attempts to earn money, his erratic behavior. It became increasingly clear that an insanity defense was being prepared. Then, on the 4th day, the unexpected happened. When the judge opened the session, Joseph Kelly rose and announced that he was ready to plead guilty. But on one condition: his execution, he insisted, must be scheduled for January 16, 1898, on that specific date, no earlier and no later. The reason was more than strange. Kelly claimed he had made a contract with the devil, and that the contract would expire on January 15th. He must die only after that date. The courtroom erupted in confusion. Journalists scribbled furiously. No one had anticipated such a declaration. The plea was accepted, and the jury was dismissed. Now the central question was no longer Kelly's guilt, but his sanity. The remainder of the proceedings would become a battle over the state of mind of a young man who claimed he had sold his soul to the devil. After Kelly's confession and his bizarre claim of a contract with the devil, the court ordered a formal psychiatric evaluation. Several prominent specialists were appointed to examine the young man and determine the state of his mind. Dr. Charles Bancroft of the New Hampshire State Asylum conducted 8 extensive interviews with Kelly. He reviewed his life history in detail, questioned him about the head injury at age 4, the seizures and convulsions, the episodes of sleepwalking. After completing his assessment, Dr. Bancroft reached a firm and unequivocal conclusion, one that stunned the courtroom with its clarity. "We are dealing with a child," Bancroft stated. "I would place his mental and moral development at approximately 8 or 9 years of age. He possesses the physical impulses and instincts of an adult man, but his capacity for judgment and reasoning is that of a 9-year-old boy." Dr. Thomas Waterman, a practicing physician from Boston, fully agreed. Using contemporary psychiatric terminology, he described Kelly as functioning at a relatively high level among individuals with similar impairments, capable of speech and purposeful action, far from helpless. Yet his adult drives were paired with the reasoning ability of a small child. Several additional medical experts examined Kelly and arrived at the same conclusion. Moreover, they unanimously agreed that his condition was incurable. The childhood brain injury had caused permanent damage. No treatment, no institutional care could reverse the arrested development of his mind. These medical opinions would prove decisive. The court now faced a fundamental question. Could a man with the mind of a child bear full responsibility for an adult crime? Until this point, Joseph Kelly had remained surprisingly cheerful, even amused. He smiled frequently and appeared to relish the public attention. But when he finally grasped the true strategy of his attorneys, that they were not arguing his innocence, but his incapacity, it struck at his pride. The real blow came when the defense introduced his poetry into evidence. The very verses he cherished, what he believed to be expressions of his soul, were read aloud in court. Attorneys commented on their simplicity, even their naivete. His writing was presented as proof of his intellectual limitations. His public lectures, his attempts to sell artificial flowers, his rooftop advertising scheme, all were reframed as evidence of impaired development rather than creativity. A reporter from the Boston Globe captured the moment. When Kelly realized his poetry was being mocked and that he was being described as severely impaired, it proved too much for him. For the first time during the trial, Joseph Kelly displayed genuine emotion. He broke down, covered his face with a handkerchief, and sobbed uncontrollably. These were not tears of fear over execution, nor were they tears of remorse. They were tears of wounded pride. Being labeled a mediocre poet, publicly humiliated, was what finally broke him. Paradoxically, the prospect of the gallows seemed to trouble him less than the public ridicule of his artistic ambitions. In that moment, many in the courtroom no longer saw a cunning criminal feigning madness. They saw a vulnerable, childlike man crushed by embarrassment. For some, it confirmed what the medical experts had testified all along. After days of testimony, psychiatric evaluations, and dramatic courtroom scenes, the judges were ready to rule. The question was no longer whether Joseph Kelly had committed the crime. He had admitted as much. The question was whether a man with the mind of an 8 or 9-year-old could be held fully accountable. The court found Kelly legally insane. This meant that although the crime had been carried out by his hands, his ability to comprehend the consequences of his actions was severely impaired. The childhood head injury, the arrested mental development, the lack of mature moral judgment, all were taken into account. The final ruling? Guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence? 30 years in the state prison in Concord. Not the gallows Kelly himself had requested. Not life imprisonment, but 3 decades behind bars. When medical experts were asked what might happen after Kelly completed his sentence, their answer was grim. They doubted he would live that long. His physical and mental condition did not suggest a long life expectancy. Kelly's reaction to the sentence was revealing. He did not express relief at avoiding execution. On the contrary, he seemed almost disappointed. When reporters asked how he felt, he responded with characteristic bluntness. "Well, I expected something different. I thought they'd hang me. But my lawyers seem satisfied, so I suppose it's all right." For a man who claimed to have made a pact with the devil and insisted on dying on January 16th, the prospect of 30 years in a prison cell may have been far more unsettling than a swift death on the gallows. If the judges felt the verdict was just, many residents of Summerssworth strongly disagreed. Outrage spread throughout the town. Kelly had avoided the gallows, and to many, that felt like a miscarriage of justice. In their eyes, he was not a pitiful man with a damaged mind, but a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of a respected cashier, Joseph Stickney. Few believed in his insanity. Could someone with the mind of a child carefully plan a robbery, devise a disguise, and cross into Canada to evade capture? No, they argued. This was a calculating criminal who had manipulated the court with tears over poetry and stories about the devil. Anger soon turned into action. 20 men from Summerssworth and neighboring Berwick met in secret. They were respectable citizens, merchants, tradesmen, laborers, united by the belief that justice had failed. A plan was devised to abduct Kelly from the jail in Dover and lynch him. Roles were discussed, details were outlined, but the conspiracy faltered for one simple reason: no one was willing to lead it. Outrage filled the meeting room, yet when it came to decisive action, courage failed them. The plan never materialized. Meanwhile, perhaps aware of the town's mood, authorities acted quickly. Joseph Kelly was quietly transferred from Dover to the state prison in Concord. There, he began serving his sentence, while the people of Summerssworth were left with a lingering sense of injustice. The case of Joseph Kelly remains one of the most unusual criminal trials of the late 19th century. It forces us to confront a timeless question: where is the boundary between evil and madness? Can a damaged mind be fully accountable for its actions? Kelly was, in many ways, a tragic figure of his era. A child whose life changed after a fall onto a rusty nail. A young man who dreamed of being a poet, yet was limited by irreversible brain injury. A defendant who smiled in court, but wept when his verses were mocked. A man who claimed he had made a pact with the devil. The court found him guilty, yet legally insane. The public demanded the gallows. And Kelly himself may never have fully understood what happened to him, or why.